Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're opening up quite a dossier, really, on one of the most enduring and, frankly, terrifying cold cases of the 20th century, the Dyatlov Pass incident.
It's a story that just grabs you, doesn't it? It's haunted investigators, mountaineers, scientists, conspiracy theorists, really everyone who hears about it for, what, over 60 years now?
Absolutely. And the power of it, I think, comes from this set of, well, seemingly impossible facts. Our sources today were pretty exhaustive. We're pulling from the original, classified Soviet investigation files from 1959 right up to the cutting-edge physics modeling from just a couple of years ago that might, just might, finally explain the core paradox.
And that paradox is key. So let's set the scene. We're on the desolate, windswept slopes of Kolatchiakal.
Which chillingly means dead mountain in the local Mansi language.
Exactly. Northern Ural Mountains, February 1959. And the whole tragedy hinges on this one single shocking event.
Right. The central mystery we have to tackle straight away is this. 9 highly experienced Soviet hikers, in the middle of the polar night, they cut their way out of a perfectly good tent.
Yeah, cut their way out. Not unzipped, cut. And they did this during a blizzard, with temperatures plummeting to around minus 30 Celsius. That's minus 22 Fahrenheit.
And they left everything. No boots, no heavy coats, no food, none of the gear absolutely essential for survival in those conditions. They just fled, as if waiting even a second for the zipper was too long.
It suggests sheer, unadulterated terror.
Weeks later, the search parties find the campsite and, well, the discoveries just piled on the questions. The bodies were found scattered over maybe 1.5 kilometers down the slope. There was this trail of partial footprints.
And the initial findings seemed almost straightforward for some of them. 6 of the 9 were found to have died from hypothermia. Tragic, yes, but, understandable given the conditions and their lack of gear.
But then there were the other 3. And this is where the story tips over into, well, genuine high strangeness.
This is the core of it. These 3 hikers had suffered massive, brutal internal trauma. We're talking about crushed ribs, multiple fractures, severe skull damage.
Injuries the original 1959 forensic expert, a Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, actually described as being, and this is a direct quote, equal to the effect of a major car crash.
Just imagine that force. But here's the kicker, the part that's confounded everyone for decades.
Despite this immense internal damage, there were no corresponding external wounds. No bruises, no cuts, no damage to the skin or soft tissue over the broken bones. How is that even possible?
It seems impossible, right? And you combine that forensic nightmare with how the Soviet state reacted.
Yeah, the investigation slammed shut, files classified top secret, the whole area closed off for years.
It's no wonder the official verdict, death by a compelling natural force, just felt thin, like a cover-up.
Especially when you throw in the other weird details. Trace radiation on clothing, reports of strange, bright spheres in the sky. It just fueled 60 years of, well, intense speculation.
Yeah.
Everything from yetis to secret weapons tests.
So, our mission today, our deep dive, is to try and be that definitive dossier. We want to synthesize everything. The trek itself, the horrifying forensics, the political angle, the cover-up, the theories, and crucially, this recent physics-based solution from 2021 that, perhaps for the first time, offers a plausible scientific explanation for that specific, bizarre trauma.
Okay, let's unpack this. Right, so to really get a handle on how strange this all is, we need to understand who these people were. Because if you've only heard the sensational stuff, you might picture, I don't know, some unprepared kids.
That's a really important point. It's the absolute opposite. We need to be crystal clear. This was not amateur hour. The Dyatlov group, led by Igor Dyatlov himself, only 23, but very capable. They were mostly students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk.
Serious hikers.
Yeah.
Athletes, really.
Definitely. They weren't just weekend warriors. They were aiming for the top certification in Soviet mountaineering. This trip was classified as a Category the 3rd trek.
Which was the highest difficulty rating, right? Like the absolute pinnacle for sport hiking in the USSR at the time.
Exactly. Think of it as the ultimate test. It was a brutal 14-day route, about 190 miles, planned for the deepest, harshest part of the Ural winter.
Wow.
Completing this successfully would earn them the Grade 3rd certification. That was the highest honor. It demanded incredible skill, navigation prowess, psychological resilience, and crucially, strict adherence to safety protocols. These people were trained, disciplined, they knew how to survive in extreme cold.
Which makes their final actions even more baffling, doesn't it?
Completely. So the group started as 10 people, Dyatlov leading, 8 others mostly in their early 20s. 2 women, Zenaida Kolmogorova and Ludmila Dubinina, were part of the team, along with other skilled members like Rustem Slobodin and Nikolai T. Bobrignol.
And there was one older member, too.
Yes, Semyon Zolotaryov. He was 37, quite a bit older than the students. He was a sports instructor and, significantly, a decorated World War II veteran.
So someone used to extreme conditions and presumably keeping a cool head under pressure.
You'd absolutely think so. His presence kind of reinforces the idea that whatever happened, the group's response, even in panic, likely had some element of discipline.
And then there's the twist of fate, the 10th member.
Yuri Yudin. Such a tragic figure in this story. On January 28th, right as they were about to start the main ski trek from the last settlement, the Second Northern, Yudin had to turn back.
Why was that?
He suffered from chronic sciatica radiculitis, nerve pain. Apparently, the long, freezing truck ride out there just flared it up terribly. He was in too much pain to ski that kind of distance.
So he said goodbye to his 9 friends.
Never knowing that this really painful, debilitating condition was the one thing that would save his life, he became the sole survivor.
God, imagine carrying that for the rest of your life. 60 years of wondering, knowing you were spared by sheer painful luck. The weight of that.
Must have been immense, and we know a lot about their planning because they kept detailed diaries, took photos. Up until January 31st, everything seems to be going perfectly to plan.
Right. They reached the headwaters of the Ospia River. And they did something important there, didn't they? The labaz.
Yes, the labaz. It's basically a raised storage cache hidden away. Standard practice for long treks like this. They stashed extra food, fuel, heavier gear they wouldn't need for the final push up the mountain.
So this shows they were thinking ahead, planning efficiently for the ascent and the return journey, not struggling or making rash decisions at this point.
Exactly. Textbook procedure. But then comes February 1st and the final, fateful decision. They start their ascent from the Ospia Valley, but the weather deteriorates, visibility drops.
And they get a bit lost.
Effectively, yeah. They end up veering west of the intended pass, finding themselves on the exposed eastern slope of Kolatsiokl itself.
Okay, so they're exposed, the weather's bad, the safe move would seem to be retreat.
Logically, yes. They're only about 1.5 kilometers, maybe a mile, from the tree line down below. The forest would have offered shelter from the wind, stable ground, much safer.
But Dyatlov chose not to retreat. He decided to make camp right there, on the open, exposed slope.
And this is where people often point fingers, suggesting incompetence. But when you look at it through the lens of high-level mountaineering, it wasn't necessarily incompetence. It was likely a calculated risk.
Oh, so.
Well, retreating meant losing all the altitude they'd just fought hard to gain. Camping high, even though exposed, positioned them perfectly for a direct 10-kilometer push to the summit of Mount Otorten the next morning. It was an aggressive strategy, typical for a Category 3rd attempt where efficiency is key. Save time, save energy, maintain position.
A strategic gamble, then, not just a blunder.
Probably. A calculated risk that tragically went horribly wrong.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just being on the slope that was the problem, it was how they camped there.
What do you mean?
This is crucial for understanding the later scientific explanation. To pitch their large tent on that slope, they had to dig into the snowpack. They cut a ledge, maybe 5 meters long, to create a flat platform. Standard practice again. But doing that, cutting into the snow on a slope that was just steep enough under specific snow conditions, they inadvertently created a weakness. They destabilized the slab of snow directly above where they planned to sleep.
So the very act of setting up camp, following procedure,
created the precise conditions needed for the disaster that unfolded just hours later. It's chilling. Expert procedure leading directly to catastrophe. Okay, so let's jump forward. The group's gone silent, and the timeline for the search starting is, well, it tells its own story.
Right. Dyatlov had told the sports club back at the Institute he'd send a telegram from Vizhai at the next settlement by February 12th.
But when the 12th came and went, no telegram arrived, but, there wasn't immediate panic.
Delays were common on these extreme treks, weren't they? Weather could hold you up for days.
Exactly. So initially people figured, okay, they're delayed. But as more days pass, the families, and particularly Yuri Yudin, the survivor, they started pushing the Institute. They knew something wasn't right.
It wasn't until February 20th, over a week late, that the pressure worked and the official search and rescue operation finally kicked off.
And it took another 6 days, February 26th, for the first major breakthrough. 2 searchers, Boris Slopsov and Mikhail Sherevin, they spotted it. The tent.
Just seeing the tent must have been a relief initially, but the scene itself, it was immediately wrong, wasn't it?
Deeply wrong. The tent was partly collapsed, partially buried in snow. But as they got closer, they saw the critical detail. The canvas. It was slashed, ripped open in several places.
And not from the outside, like an animal attack.
No, the investigation confirmed this definitively. The cuts were made from the inside. Whatever happened, the people inside felt they had to get out now, destroying their only shelter in the process. Cutting was faster than finding the zipper in the dark, presumably.
Instant, terrifying urgency. But inside the tent.
That's the other weird part. Despite the violent exit, inside, things were relatively orderly. Backpacks were lined up, there was food laid out, bits of salo, cured fat, chocolate, some canned stuff. Maybe they were having a late meal or preparing one.
But the crucial stuff was still there.
All of it. Every single pair of Valenki, their felt boots left behind. Their warm fur coats, heavy trousers, axes, knives. Probably a radio, everything you'd need to survive a -30 night. Just abandoned.
Unbelievable. So they flee the tent, underdressed, into a blizzard. What did the searchers find next?
They found the tracks, leading away from the tent, downhill, heading towards the forest about 1.5 kilometers away.
9 sets of tracks.
Yes, clearly 9 sets of footprints preserved in the snow, and the state of dress was obvious even from the prints. The official 1959 report notes they showed people walking with socks, some with one boot, some with felt boots, some barefoot.
Barefoot. In that snow.
It beggars belief. But the tracks themselves led the initial investigators to conclude they left of their own accord on foot. They weren't dragged, they weren't chased by something, leaving other prints. They walked away.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because you've got this fundamental contradiction. People call it the organized panic.
Exactly. The slashed tent, the abandoned gear that screams pure, irrational terror, primal fear, flee at all costs.
But the footprints tell a different story. They weren't scattered, running wildly in all directions. They were apparently in single file, following each other's steps down the slope.
Like a trained, disciplined retreat. Almost textbook emergency evacuation procedure to maintain group cohesion in low visibility. Keep together, follow the leader.
So how can both be true? How could you be so terrified you cut your tent open and leave your boots, but simultaneously composed enough to walk calmly downhill in single file?
It makes no sense if you think of it as one continuous state. It almost forces you to consider a two-stage event.
Okay, what does that look like?
Stage 1, the event. Something sudden, catastrophic happens right at the tent, maybe inside, maybe just outside. It demands instant, chaotic escape. Cutting the tent, no time for boots, just get out.
Total panic.
Total panic. But then, stage 2, the response. The moment they're outside, in the freezing wind and snow, maybe their training kicks back in. Perhaps Dyatlov or the veteran Zolotaryov takes charge, gets them grouped up.
And they realize the immediate threat, whatever it was, is maybe still up there on the slope, or a risk of something else happening there.
Precisely. So they transition from panicked flight to an organized, if desperate, retreat. Downhill towards the perceived safety of the trees. They're executing a plan, albeit a flawed one, given their lack of gear.
They feared whatever happened at the tent more than they feared the cold itself, at least initially.
That seems to be the only way to reconcile the evidence. An instant of overwhelming terror, followed by a disciplined but ultimately fatal attempt to regroup and survive. The transition is key.
So the search continues, and eventually they find the bodies. But they weren't all together, were they? They seemed to fall into 2 distinct groups, telling 2 very different tragic stories.
That's right. The discoveries happened in phases. First, they found 5 bodies relatively quickly, mostly near that forest line or on the slope back up towards the tent. These became known as sort of the hypothermia group.
And the other 4?
They weren't found for another 2 months, much later in May when the snow began to melt. They were deeper in the woods, in a ravine, and their injuries, well, that's the trauma group.
Okay, let's start with group 1, the hypothermia victims. Their deaths seem more straightforwardly tragic given the circumstances.
In terms of cause of death, yes. It highlights just how quickly and brutally hypothermia kills when you're exposed like that. The first 2 found were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonashenko.
Where were they?
About 1.5 kilometers from the tent, just inside the tree line under a big old Siberian cedar tree. And they were in the worst state of undress, basically just their thermal underwear.
So they made it the furthest, but were the least protected.
Seems that way. And the scene there told a story. Searchers found the remnants of a small fire, just a few charred branches. A desperate, failed attempt to get warm.
And something else. About the tree itself.
Yes, branches on the cedar were broken quite high up, maybe 15 feet or so. This strongly suggested one or both of them had climbed the tree.
Why would they do that? To look for the tent.
That's the most logical reason. Or maybe to scan the slope, see if whatever danger they perceived was still there, or if the others were coming. A desperate act of reconnaissance.
And their physical state. You mentioned burns, someone biting their knuckle. That sounds violent.
It sounds violent, but it's likely the awful reality of hypothermia setting in. Krivonashenko had bad burns on his hands, Doroshenko too, probably from trying to manage the fire with numb fingers, and the bitten knuckle. It's not a sign of fighting. In the final stages, the nervous system goes haywire. You lose sensation, pain signals get crossed or ignored. It's more likely a sign of the body and mind shutting down, performing actions without realizing the damage.
Horrifying. And the fact they were almost naked. That's the paradoxical undressing thing.
Exactly. It's a known, though deeply disturbing, phenomenon in terminal hypothermia. As the body fails, the brain gets confused. Blood vessels near the skin, which have been clamped shut to save heat, suddenly relax. The person gets this overwhelming false sensation of being incredibly hot.
So in their delirium, they think they need to cool down.
Precisely. They start tearing off clothes, which of course just massively accelerates heat loss and hastens death. It's one of the cruelest tricks the cold plays.
God, okay, who else was in this first group?
The other three were found scattered higher up the slope, between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin.
Also died of hypothermia.
Yes, the elements claimed them too, but their positions were significant. All three were found facing uphill towards the tent.
They were trying to get back.
It looks overwhelmingly like a final, desperate attempt. Maybe they realized the fire wasn't enough, or the danger at the tree line was just the cold. They were trying to crawl back to shelter, back to their gear. Dyatlov was found closest, only about 300 meters from the tent he'd fled.
Just agonizingly close. And Slobodin had a minor injury.
Yeah, small fracture in his skull. Initially, it was thought maybe he slipped and hit his head on a rock or ice. Non-fatal in itself, but perhaps it contributed to his disorientation or hastened the hypothermia. It also kind of foreshadowed the much more severe trauma found later.
Right, which brings us to Group 2, the trauma victims, found 2 months later.
Correct. In May 1959, as the thaw set in, searchers finally located the last 4 hikers. They were about 75 meters further into the woods from the cedar tree, buried under something like 4 meters of snow in a den they dug into the side of a small ravine near a stream.
They dug a den. So they were alive and functioning for quite a while after the first group died.
Absolutely. Building a snow den, even a basic one, takes time, effort, and rational thought. They were clearly trying to create shelter to survive.
And their clothing told a story, too, you mentioned.
A grim one, yes. This group, Ludmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov, they were better dressed than the first group found, but it wasn't just their own clothes.
They'd taken clothes from the dead.
Yes. The evidence was clear. Dubinina was wearing parts of Krivonashenko's trousers, which were torn. Zolotaryov had Dubinina's coat and hat. They had scavenged clothing from their fallen comrades. A horrific necessity, but proof they were alive, aware, and fighting to survive after Doroshenko and Krivonashenko had perished near the cedar.
Okay, but 3 of these 4 didn't die from cold or exhaustion, did they?
No. 3 of them died from absolutely devastating internal injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had what's called a comminuted skull fracture. That means the bone wasn't just cracked, it was shattered into multiple pieces. Requires extreme force.
And the other 2?
Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both suffered massive chest trauma. Multiple ribs crushed on both sides. Zolotaryov had something like 6 ribs broken. Dubinina had 4. And bizarrely, the fractures suggested compression from different directions.
This is where Dr. Volzhersdeny, the original medical examiner, came in. His findings are central to the whole mystery.
They are the forensic mystery. Volzhersdeny stated very clearly, the force needed to cause these injuries was incredibly high. His comparison was a major car crash or maybe the shockwave from a large explosion, immense pressure.
But, and this is the crucial, but no external damage.
Precisely. No bruises, no cuts, no significant soft tissue damage over the areas where the bones were crushed underneath. The skin was intact. This is the core forensic paradox. How do you shatter someone's skull or crush their rib cage like that without leaving a mark on the outside?
Could a person do that to another person? A fight?
Volzhersdeny explicitly ruled that out. He stated the injuries could not have been caused by human beings because a human attacker Even using a weapon would inevitably cause significant external damage along with the internal trauma. You can't exert that kind of focused, crushing pressure without breaking the skin or causing massive bruising.
So it had to be something else. Something non-human or maybe environmental.
That was his conclusion, some overwhelming force. And we absolutely have to address the other details here, the ones that often get sensationalized and muddy the waters.
You mean the missing tongue and eyes?
Exactly. Dubinina was found missing her tongue, eyes, and some soft tissue around the mouth. Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. This is where the theories about aliens, yetis, or gruesome torture really took off.
But there's a more mundane explanation for that part, isn't there?
There is, and it's important to separate it from the internal trauma mystery. Remember, these 4 bodies lay in a ravine in running water from the stream for over 2 months, from February until May.
Decomposition would be different in water.
Right. Very different, especially in flowing water with likely small scavengers, rodents, insects, even fish, perhaps. Dr. Vozhrazdeny himself, in the original report, concluded this damage was post-mortem. Natural decomposition and scavenging in a wet environment. Soft tissues like eyes, lips, and tongue go first. They are easily consumed or simply rot away quickly.
So the truly baffling, unexplained part wasn't the missing bits. It was the massive internal crushing that happened while they were alive, without leaving an external trace.
That's the heart of it. Crushed by car crash forces, somehow surviving that long enough to build a den and scavenge clothes, only to succumb to those injuries and the cold later. It just screams for an extraordinary explanation, or a cover-up.
Right, and the idea of a cover-up wasn't just based on the weird injuries. There was other anomalous evidence swirling around the investigation that really pushed things into conspiracy territory.
The radiation, for instance, that always comes up. Traces of radiation found on some of their clothes. Yeah, that was a big one. Forensic tests did find low levels of beta radiation on a couple of items of clothing, notably belonging to Krivonashenko and Kolevatov, and it was described as washable, meaning surface contamination.
Which immediately made people think, secret nuclear test, radiological weapon, something exploded nearby.
That was the jump, understandably, in the Cold War context. But if you dig into the background of that specific region, Sverdlovsk Oblast in the late 1950s, there's a much less explosive, though still quite concerning, explanation.
You mean it didn't necessarily happen at the pass?
Exactly. The fact it was washable suggests it was residue brought to the pass, not generated by an event there. And Sverdlovsk was ground zero for the Soviet nuclear program.
And there had been a major incident nearby just before this, right? The Kishtim disaster.
Huge incident. Kishtim in 1957 was the 3rd worst nuclear accident in history, after Chernobyl and Fukushima. A nuclear waste storage tank exploded at the Mayak facility, not that far from Sverdlovsk. It contaminated a vast area.
And the Soviets covered it up completely at the time.
Totally suppressed. But thousands were evacuated, cleanup operations were ongoing, the whole region was dealing with the fallout, literally. So the idea of people living and working in or near Sverdlovsk having trace contamination on their clothes, it's actually quite plausible.
Did any of the hikers have connections?
We know at least 2 did. Yuri Krivonashenko apparently worked at Mayak or was involved in the Kishim cleanup efforts. Alexander Kolevatov worked in the nuclear industry at a facility sometimes referred to as P.O. Box 9, which was involved with plutonium production.
So they could easily have picked up trace radiation from their jobs or just the environment back home and carried it with them.
It's highly probable an anomaly, yes, but likely an industrial or environmental one from their origin point, not evidence of a nuclear event on Kholat Shakil itself.
Okay, so maybe the radiation is explainable. But what about the other big anomaly, the bright spheres?
Ah, yes. This one is harder to dismiss and points more directly towards that idea of state secrecy. There were multiple independent reports. Other hiking groups in the Urals around the same time, some military personnel, even local indigenous Mansi people, they all described seeing strange lights in the sky, usually glowing orange spheres or flying balls of light, particularly on the night of February 1st, 2nd, and in the weeks surrounding the incident.
And the original investigation knew about this.
Oh, yes. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, documented these reports in his private notes. But, crucially, any mention of these spheres was completely omitted from the official 1959 case file that was eventually classified.
Which screams cover-up.
It absolutely does. And that leads us straight to how the investigation ended, abruptly. In May 1959, the whole thing was shut down. Case closed, file stamped top secret, and the entire area around Dyatlov Pass was declared off-limits for 3 years.
With that very vague official cause of death.
death by a compelling natural force, or sometimes translated as an overwhelming natural force. It's vague enough to mean anything or nothing. And given the weird injuries, the missing spheres from the report, the secrecy, well, you can see why people thought the state had to be hiding something sinister related to the deaths.
But maybe they were hiding something else, something unrelated that just happened to coincide.
That's where Lev Ivanov's later testimony becomes critical. Decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, he was finally able to speak freely.
And what did he say?
He published an article admitting he'd been directly ordered by high-ranking regional officials to shut down the investigation and classify everything. Why? Because he was getting too close to linking the hikers' deaths to those bright spheres. He said he was almost sure the spheres were connected.
So he believed the spheres caused the deaths.
He seemed to lean that way, yes. But the most compelling explanation now, looking back with knowledge of Soviet military programs, suggests a different connection. What were those spheres?
Not aliens, presumably.
Probably not. The leading theory connects them to the Soviet R-7 Semyorka rocket program. This was their first ICBM, the rocket that launched Sputnik. Its test launches often went over the northern Urals from Baikonur or Plesetsk.
And these early rocket launches, they could look like glowing spheres.
Apparently, yes. Especially at night, the burning fuel stages, engine plumes, or even malfunctions could create exactly the kind of bright, orange, slow-moving lights described by witnesses. And the secrecy around the ICBM program was utterly paramount during the Cold War.
So the theory is, the hikers died from something else, maybe natural.
But their deaths happened at the same time and place that these secret R-7 tests or their visible effects were occurring. If the investigation threatened to expose details about the rocket program flight paths, timing, visual signatures, because witnesses linked the spheres to the night the hikers died,
then the state would shut it down to protect the military secret, even if it meant obscuring the truth about the hikers.
Precisely. It becomes a bureaucratic imperative. The hikers' tragedy becomes secondary to national security. Classifying the deaths as a vague, natural force neatly solves the problem. It buries the awkward questions about lights in the sky without admitting to secret missile tests.
So the cover-up was real, but it was covering up unrelated military activity, not necessarily hiding the cause of death itself.
That's the most logical synthesis. The state's secrecy about its own activities was misinterpreted for decades as secrecy about what killed the hikers, fueling endless speculation. A tragic coincidence of timing and location.
Okay, so for 60 years, you had this mess of contradictions.
Yeah.
Impossible injuries, weird lights, a cover-up, and dozens of theories. We should probably quickly mention some that were ruled out early on.
Right. The Mansi attack theory, locals attacking them, that was dismissed pretty quickly by the original investigation. No signs of struggle consistent with an attack, nothing was stolen, and the Mansi were peaceful.
And the Yeti or other paranormal explanations. Fun for campfire stories, but...
Zero physical evidence, no strange tracks, nothing. Infrasound, low-frequency sound causing panic was also proposed. It might explain the flight, maybe, but it absolutely cannot explain the specific, massive internal trauma. That remained the sticking point.
Then more recently, the Russian government actually reopened the case, didn't they, in 2019?
They did, yes. The Prosecutor General's office, they aimed for a definitive answer, but their approach was, well, limited.
How so?
They announced up front they would only consider 3 natural causes: a regular avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane-force wind event. They explicitly ruled out anything criminal or, exotic.
Trying to finally put the conspiracies to bed, perhaps.
Possibly. But it felt a bit like deciding the conclusion before the investigation. And when they announced their findings in July 2020...
They landed on avalanche, right?
Oh, yes, avalanche. But their explanation was pretty thin on the physics. Critics immediately jumped on it. The slope was generally considered not steep enough, below the usual 30-degree threshold for large avalanches. There was no big debris field found later. And how does a typical avalanche explain the tent being cut from the inside, not just flattened? It lacks specifics.
So it felt like official closure, but not really a satisfying scientific explanation.
Not to many people who'd studied the case closely, but then just 6 months later, January 2021, came what many now see as the breakthrough.
This is the Swiss study.
Exactly. By Dr. Johann Gaume, a snow avalanche simulation expert at EPFL in Lausanne, and Dr. Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer from ETH Zurich. They published in a major journal, Communications, Earth, and Environment. And their model is the first one built from the ground up using advanced physics to try and explain all the paradoxes together.
Okay, so what did they propose? What kind of avalanche?
Not the big, powdery cloud type most people imagine. They proposed a relatively small, delayed-release slab avalanche. Think of a dense, compact block of snow breaking free and sliding down as a single stiff unit.
A slab avalanche.
Oh.
Okay, but how does that solve the problems? Let's start with the slope angle, if it was too gentle.
Their modeling showed the slope was borderline, maybe just under 30 degrees. But the crucial factor wasn't the natural slope alone. It was the hiker's intervention, that 5-meter-long cut they made into the snowpack to level the tent floor.
Ah, the ledge they dug.
Precisely. That cut acted like a trigger point. It created an artificial weak layer in the snowpack just above them, fatally compromising the stability of the slab resting there.
So the slope was just steep enough, combined with the cut they made.
That's the key insight. Their own actions, standard procedure though it was, created the specific hazard. It's incredibly tragic.
Okay, that deals with the slope. What
Right.
about the delay? They cut the ledge in the afternoon, but the event happened hours later, around midnight. Why didn't it slide immediately?
This is maybe the most elegant part of their model. It involves the specific weather conditions, those strong katabatic winds that sweep down Ural slopes at night.
The winds were doing something to the snow.
Yes, they were constantly blowing more snow onto the slope above the tent, loading up that specific slab that the hikers had already weakened with their cut. It's called wind slab formation or snowdrift loading.
So it was like slowly adding weight onto a weak point.
Exactly. Slowly, steadily, hour after hour through the evening and night. Their calculations, based on snow mechanics and meteorology, showed it would take somewhere between 9.5 and 13.5 hours for enough new snow to accumulate, reach a critical stress point, and cause that slab to fracture along the tent line and slide.
And that timing, does it match the estimated time of death?
It matches perfectly. The autopsy's estimated death occurred 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. If they ate in the early evening, the slab failure window calculated by the model falls exactly around midnight or shortly after. The wind literally loaded the gun that their own excavation had aimed.
Wow. Okay, that's the slope and the delay.
Yeah.
Now, the biggest one, the trauma. How does a relatively small slab of snow cause car crash injuries without external marks?
This is where they used some pretty sophisticated modeling. They drew on data from car crash, testing how human bodies react to blunt force trauma, and combined it with advanced snow physics simulations. They actually used animation code developed for the movie Frozen to model how snow behaves under pressure.
Seriously. Frozen.
Apparently so. It's very good at simulating snow dynamics. What their model showed was critical. The way the impact happened matters hugely. The hikers were likely lying down, asleep, or resting in their sleeping bags.
Horizontal. Relaxed.
Right. When a dense, rigid slab of snow hits a prone body, especially when pressed against the hard-packed snow floor of the tent, the force isn't distributed like a punch or a fall. The slab acts like a non-deforming piston, meaning the clothing, the sleeping bag, maybe a thin layer of snow on the tent, it cushions the surface, it prevents cuts and bruises on the skin. But the sheer weight and momentum of that dense slab transmits immense compressive force directly through the soft tissues to the skeleton underneath.
Crushing the ribs and skull internally while the outside looks relatively unharmed.
Exactly. It perfectly explains Vosrozdeni's 1959 paradox: high internal force, low external damage. The model simulated impacts consistent with the observed injuries, the specific types of rib fractures, the comminuted skull fracture. It showed this mechanism could produce those results without needing massive tons of snow or destroying the tent completely.
Okay, that actually makes sense. It's specific. And finally, how does this explain the flight paradox? The cutting the tent, fleeing without gear.
Well, imagine being woken violently by the terrifying sound of the slab cracking above you, immediately followed by the crushing weight hitting the tent, hitting you, injuring your friends beside you in the dark.
Instant chaos and terror.
Absolutely. Your training screams avalanche. You don't know if it's just a small slide or the precursor to a massive one about to bury you completely. The immediate overriding instinct drilled into experienced mountaineers is escape. Get out of the potential burial zone now.
So cutting the tent is the fastest way out. Forget boots, forget coats. Just get everyone out before more snow comes down.
That's the idea. They cut their way out, possibly pulling the injured with them, and then executed that emergency retreat protocol single file, downhill, away from the perceived ongoing danger on the slope. The flight wasn't a rational panic in the end. It was a rational, if desperate, response to a terrifying, life-threatening event that had already inflicted devastating injuries.
They were choosing speed and escape over warmth, a gamble forced on them by the avalanche itself.
A gamble that, tragically, due to the extreme cold and their lack of protection, they lost. Hashtag tag conclusion and final thought. So when you put all the pieces together, this 2021 slab avalanche model, it's remarkably compelling, isn't it? It really seems to reframe the whole narrative. It takes the Dyatlov group's final hours from being this episode of bizarre, inexplicable paranoia and turns it into a story of a heroic, though ultimately tragic, fight for survival against a very specific, very brutal combination of physics and natural forces.
Yeah, it feels like it accounts for almost everything in a logical chain. The cut tent, the specific internal injuries without external marks, that crucial time delay, and even the organized yet desperate nature of the flight.
It does seem to tie the physical evidence together very neatly.
So if we synthesize everything we've discussed today, the whole story looks something like this. The Dyatlov Pass incident was most likely a tragedy caused by that compelling natural force the Soviets mentioned specifically, a rare delict-release slab avalanche triggered by the hiker's own campsite preparation.
But, and this is crucial, this natural disaster had the profound misfortune to happen at the exact same time and in the same remote airspace as completely unrelated, highly secret Soviet military activity, likely those R-7 rocket tests.
Which created the bright spheres.
Exactly. And that coincidence is what created the perception of a cover-up related to the deaths. The real conspiracy wasn't about hiding murder or aliens. It was the state covering up its own military secrets. The hikers were just tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time, both geologically and geopolitically.
And modern science, using physics and simulation, has now largely explained the physical mechanism of their deaths. It puts the core forensic paradox to rest.
It seems to, yes, though we have to acknowledge that 2021 model, brilliant as it is.
It doesn't explain the bright spheres.
No. It explains the deaths, but it has nothing to say about the lights in the sky reported by multiple independent witnesses. That remains the one significant, unresolved thread that points directly to that overlap, the natural tragedy coinciding with the government secrecy.
A reminder of the Cold War context looming over everything.
Absolutely. Today, thankfully, the pass is officially named Dyatlov Pass. It serves as a memorial to those 9 skilled, brave individuals.
Who died not because they were careless, but because of this perfect storm, really. A confluence of their own expert actions, specific snow physics, brutal weather, and the shadow of state secrecy.
So what does this all mean? I think the final word has to be about that collision. A tragic collision between human survival instincts pushed to their absolute limit, the unforgiving and sometimes complex physics of the natural world, and the cynical priorities of Cold War bureaucracy.
It's a powerful conclusion. The science explains the how of the trauma, but that initial moment, the sheer terror that made 9 experienced people abandon everything, boots included, it still gives you pause. The sound of that slab cracking, the sudden weight in the dark, it must have been so immediate, so overwhelming, it just short-circuited all their training for a crucial few seconds.
That primal fear response.
Yeah. So the thought we want to leave you with is this. Given their high level of training, did that unique combination, the shock of the unexpected impact, the crushing force, maybe the blinding confusion of the blizzard outside, amplify their fear beyond anything even their rigorous training could prepare them for? Was cutting the tent and fleeing the only possible response left in that split second, whatever the cost? And hovering over it all, how does the memory of Yuri Yudin, the man spared by illness, shape how we remember this enduring tragic mystery?